There's literally thousands of bands out there, all striving for the same dream. Very few actually succeed. It's not always the best musicians that make the best bands. There's a chemistry that happens between the band members. This chemistry creates the band's unique sound. For Oasis, that sound came from Manchester, England. On the southern outskirts of Manchester lie the suburbs of Levisham and Burnage. Now, most of the credit for the success of Oasis is usually attributed to the sibling duo of Noel and Liam Gallagher. And it makes sense. You have the obviously gifted songwriter in the older brother Noel, and he's got his good-looking younger brother with style and attitude to sing his little gems. These two boys grew up in Burnage, in this humble abode you see right here. They literally lived right down the street from the infamous Sifters, the record shop that Liam sings about in the song Shaker Maker. I purchased an Oasis Greatest Hits compilation from Mr. Sifter myself because, I'm weird like that. This neighborhood had two main parks that separated the different suburbs. It was in these parks the young boys would gather for a game of football or to get into some trouble, as boys do. It was also these parks that brought together the boys that would make up Oasis. The band's original conception can be traced back to when Tony McCarroll met Paul McGuigan at a football tryout when they were young boys. They became mates from that meeting. Guigsy lived in this neighborhood near the local bathhouses. He was a guy who kept to himself and was interested in trying new things. Tony was born at St. Mary's Hospital in Victoria Park and lived on Wetherell Street in Levisham. He attended St. Mary's Primary School and began hanging around with Guigsy. The two of them would get together and smoke pot and listen to records. Tony worked at this establishment that used to be Needham's Butchers on Stockport Road. He saved up enough to buy his first proper drum kit and taught himself to play by listening to Beatles and Johnny Cash records. One day, Tony and Guigsy were hanging out at the local park, and they were chased from the park by local thugs. As they were fleeing the park and cut through an alleyway, this is where they came upon and were introduced to one Noel Gallagher. Noel was in this gang, but he let the two boys get away. They began to know each other by hanging out at the park and playing football. One day, Noel and his older brother Paul decided to bring their little brother to the park. This was their introduction to their future rock star, Liam Gallagher. Years went by, and the boys went about their lives. Enter Paul Bonehead Authors. From the get-go, the most talented musician of the bunch. He was the only one with prior band experience, and had been playing the piano since he was a young lad. Bonehead was hanging out one day at a student club called Severe in the suburb of Fallowfield. It was here that he met Guigsy, and convinced him to pick up the bass, so that the two of them can jam. Guigsy, being a guy who just wanted to try new things, decided to give it a go. Sometimes it's that simple to spark something great. They recruited local mate Chris Hutton to sing, and they formed a band called The Rain. But unfortunately, they had to use a drum machine. As The Rain were getting their footing, Guigsy remembered his old mate Tony, who was a drummer. He and Bonehead went to meet with Tony at the local pub, the Church Inn. Playing drums in a band was something Tony always wanted to do, so he went to go see them live at the Milestone, which used to sit at this location. Tony did join the band, and they began rehearsing at this Victorian hotel. But over time, Guigsy became unhappy with singer Chris Hutton. This is where another major player in the early stages of Oasis comes in. Meet Big Yoon. He ran a local car valet service, whose clients included the Manchester United Football Club. Big Yoon was friends with Bonehead, and he's the one that recommended that he give young Liam Gallagher a go. Funny that, it was these three gentlemen that are responsible for introducing us all to the Gallagher brothers. Liam auditioned for the two of them at Tony's house on Wrighton Avenue in Gorton. Because it was in Tony's house, they didn't have a proper drum kit set up, so Tony had to play the bongos, while Bonehead just had a beat-up old acoustic guitar. Not much of an audition for someone who would become a future rock and roll icon. But they saw immediately that he had the look and the attitude that we all know about. He was in. And so it begins. If they only had a crystal ball and can see what just happened at Tony's house that day. Which brings me back to that chemistry thing. Bands either have it or they don't. They immediately began rehearsing with Liam at the Grove in Longsight, but got kicked out for stealing alcohol. So they took the operation further south down the road to Stockport. They rehearsed here at Greenhouse Rooms, and it was here where the Oasis sound was born. Make no mistake about it, it was Tony McCarroll on the drums that was the driving force and the energy behind this Oasis sound. It was just one talented guitar player and a bass player who only knew the basics. It was Tony. Tony not only kept the beat simple, but drove the music forward. He wasn't the most gifted or flashiest drummer, but he was solid and created the backbone to one of the biggest rock bands ever. Again, it's not always the most talented musicians that make the best music. Ringo Starr wasn't the flashiest of drummers, but he was perfect for the Beatles. If Oasis began with a more seasoned drummer who liked to show off his skills and constantly fill the spaces with elaborate fills, Oasis as we know it would never have existed. Tony's driving style, mixed with the lazy swing, set the bedrock upon which the guitars were free to roam and holler. For a bunch of guys who had virtually no experience at this, it was perfect. The band was free to concentrate on the feel and the vibe of the music, rather than just showcasing their musicianship. These four lads rehearsed at Greenhouse Rooms for 8 months solid before Noel even knew about them. Noel was off on the road being a roadie for the band in Spiral Carpets. Liam had one of their tour posters hung on his bedroom wall. It was Big Yoon, once again, who saw the name Oasis on the poster advertising a gig at the Oasis Leisure Centre in Swindon. Liam suggested it to the other band members, and the name was changed. There's Big Yoon, setting the course, once again. The very first gig with the name Oasis was in 1991 at a place on Little Peter Street called The Boardwalk. It was at this gig that Noel first saw his little brother being the frontman of a band and was instantly impressed with his younger sibling. He told Liam that the band needed him and he wanted to join. Liam began suggesting it to the other band members, but they made him sweat it out. It was around the time of this gig that the band moved into the same building as the Boardwalk, in rehearsal rooms set up downstairs. It was in this room that they decided to give Noel a shot. It was originally suggested by Liam that Noel replace Guigsy on the bass. It was Tony who stuck up for him and said no, and replied that Noel should be a lead guitarist instead. And so it was. Tony was already showing the type of loyalty that would not be reciprocated. So we can see it around this time the band's sound had already been formulated. Noel brought an uncanny knack for catchy melodies and song structure, and added the finishing touches to an already established mix and raised it to new heights. At first, Noel didn't want to step on Bonehead's toes as the songwriter of the band, but it soon became obvious who the genius was, and from that moment on, the songs would be coming from Noel. After months of rehearsing together, Bonehead's brother got them the opportunity to record a demo tape at Out of the Blue Studios in Manchester. It wasn't the best of productions, and it was evident that they were still all pretty new at this. But it was this first demo tape that landed them their first TV appearance on the Blackpool Roadshow. Unfortunately, it never aired. After a bit more fine-tuning, they attempted another stab at creating a demo. this time at Abraham Moss Studios, located here in the Cheetham Hill section of Manchester. Around this time, Noel was unceremoniously sacked from his Inspiral Carpets gig, so the band was now able to rehearse 5 times a week. Inspiral Carpets. They couldn't even detect that genius was amongst them. The boys all started working together as valet with Big Yoon from Manchester United. So again, we can see that Big Yoon already introduced him to Liam as the singer, suggested the name change to Oasis, and kept the band employed. As the band's songwriting progressed, they decided to head over to Liverpool and work on some songs with a band called The Real People. It was during this 3-month boot camp that the band really got it together, and the foundation was set for world domination. It was Chris and Tony Griffiths that showed them how to really structure a hip-hop song, how to identify hooks, and where and when to use them. It was Chris that changed Liam's vocal approach, and would record vocal lines and have Liam listen to them in headphones and sing along. So for all the credit that Noel takes for being the songwriting genius, we can certainly see in large part where it came from.
We know what happens and what goes on. Liam and Noel know what goes on.
And we lie. Nobody says it's wrong, so we don't ask why. Go away, leave me alone.
The band went back to rehearsing at the Boardwalk in Manchester. It was here that they met another band of all females that told them they were playing a gig in Glasgow, Scotland at King Tut's Wawa Hut, and suggested that they come along. They agreed, intent on also playing themselves. When they arrived, the promoter refused, but somehow the band were able to talk their way onto the bill. This bit of happenstance would prove vital, for at that gig would be the English alternative music icon, Alan McGee, owner of Creation Records. It was he who influenced and changed Noel Gallagher into the iconic rock figure that we see today. One night while smoking weed, Noel confessed to the rest of the band that McGee had told him that he was special and that they are nothing without him. Noel obviously believed this, and the band can see that a new Noel was born, one they didn't necessarily like. Alan McGee actively encouraged the band to party hard in hopes of catching their folly in full effect, and thus leaking it to the papers for maximum exposure and publicity. The band didn't actually sign to Creation Records, but rather to Sony Records. McGee would fetch his finder's fee and actively steer the band's career from that point on. After agreeing to this record deal, Noel and his attitude changed forever. He soon moved out of the suburbs and into Manchester city centre at the swanky India House, and advised that the rest of the band stop hanging around Levenshulme. He wanted them to distance themselves from the small-timers. It was around this time that Bonehead, who had never missed a rehearsal before, was in the process of moving house. So he had to skip one afternoon's rehearsal. Noel got lippy and threatened to sack Bonehead. Bonehead was furious and came after Noel. It's the only documented rift between the two that we know of. Creation had given Noel an advance to buy some new gear for the band. He got himself a shiny new guitar and something new for everyone else except Tony. It seemed that Noel had always had it in for Tony. He constantly picked on his drumming, his hairstyle, his clothes, and had no problem showing his disrespect. I always found it funny that a band that had members that dressed like this, had their hairlines like this, and had hairstyles like this, that this is what Noel would make a point to single out about Tony as the one with the awful look. As far as his drumming goes, no one in the band was a virtuoso with his instrument at this time. They played basic chord structures and standard riffs. Now I understand the importance of having a good drummer. It can definitely make or break a band. But Oasis came on the scene as a phenomenon. The competence of the drummer was certainly not holding them back. The first introduction the general public got from the band was the release of their first single, Supersonic. The first sounds we heard? Tony leading the charge. It would set the foundation. This is what it is, this is how it goes. But for some reason it was never good enough for Noel. He had a master plan, and somewhere along the line, it didn't include Tony. On the day the band were to sign the record contract with Sony, the limousines picked them up bright and early and got them all good and pissed by the time they arrived at Sony headquarters in London. The champagne was flowing all day. So when the band were asked to come up and sign their documents, they were too drunk to read through their stack of papers. Unfortunately for them, the original documents they had read previously had been altered by Noel and now gave him and his brother the rights to the name Oasis and gave exclusive power to Noel to fire any band member at any time at his discretion. To add insult, Tony noticed that his name had been added to the bottom in ink, while everyone else's name was typed in the document. Should have been seeing the writing on the wall. At the time, it wasn't a major concern for Tony, because the band was beginning to take off, and I mean full blast. Supersonic was a hit, and the English press was catching on. The first album definitely maybe hit the shelves, and became the fastest selling debut album in British history. 2 gigs in, the audiences around England became bigger and bigger. The record company then set up a short tour of Japan. The band knew that they were taking off in England, but they didn't know what to expect on foreign soil, especially a country whose main language wasn't even English. When they arrived, it was full-on Oasis mania. They came home feeling like proper rock stars. As the band continued to grow, it was time to take on America. Not an easy egg to crack. The mania they had experienced in Japan was nowhere to be found in the US. It's in these moments where it's gut check time for any band. The drug and alcohol consumption had been heavy, but by the time they reached Los Angeles, it got stepped up a few notches. A local had introduced them to crystal meth, and it had the band tweaking proper. They played a showcase at the famous Whiskey A Go-Go, and it didn't go too well. The drugs had taken its toll, and at times the band weren't even playing the same song together. Noel was outraged, and the next day, he bailed. He took all the money they had for the tour and took off for San Francisco to hang out with a girl he had recently met. This girl became the inspiration for the song Talk Tonight.
Landed, stranded, hardly even knew your name. I wanna talk tonight.
So this was the first instance where Noel turned his back on the band, and it wouldn't be the last. A week or so later, Noel returned, and they finished out the tour. They came home to England knackered and frustrated. But that soon passed, as they had one single after another reaching the top 10 in the charts in the UK. So it was off to another round of gigs in Europe in much larger venues to massive audiences. One of those gigs was at Cliff's Pavilion in Southend, which was recorded and released as the DVD Live by the Sea. A few days later, they were off to Paris to play a gig at Le Bataclan, the same venue that saw the 2015 terrorist attack that killed 90 people. It would also prove to be the nails in the coffin for drummer Tony McCarroll. The previous night, Tony had an argument with his girlfriend, and it kept Noel awake. Noel told Tony that he didn't like him or his girlfriend and threatened to sack him. After sound-checking his drums, Tony walked by Noel, who had a dismissive look on his face. Tony stood right in front of him, and Noel asked, "What the fuck do you want?" At this point, Tony just lost it, and threatened to kick the shit out of Noel. No reaction. Up until this point, the band never did encores, but tonight, Noel called for one, and requested they do Supersonic. Noel then let Tony enter the stage by himself and started the drum intro. This went on for about 3 minutes before Noel walked on stage, flickered his cigarette in Tony's direction, and the rest of the band joined in. Apparently letting Tony have his 3-minute solo was Noel's way of saying goodbye. 2 nights later, Oasis had their biggest gig to date at a sold-out Sheffield arena. 2 days after that, Oasis had their first #1 single with Some Might Say, which they performed that week on Top of the Pops.
It is Some Might Say!
It would be Tony's last appearance with the band. Noel had their manager Marcus call Tony to give him the news. The band's first casualty of Noel Gallagher. Tony was replaced with Alan White, the brother of Paul Weller's drummer Steve White, who had become an acquaintance of Noel's. Not long after that, Grigsy left the band, citing nervous exhaustion. So now the entire original rhythm section was gone. Grigsy was replaced by Scott McLeod, who was the bassist for the Ya-Ya's. But that only lasted a few weeks, as McLeod backed out claiming that he had made a mistake joining the band. Here's a guy who just jumped onto the biggest band in the world at the time, and he can only put up with a few weeks of the madness. Grigsy agreed to rejoin soon after. This Oasis lineup continued until 1999, releasing 2 more massive albums, What's the Story, Morning Glory, and Be Here Now. During this time, the band was as popular as ever, setting a record for an outdoor concert held in the UK by playing to 250,000 people over 2 days at Nebworth. However, in 1999, the original 3 members were to be no more. Bonehead left the band, explaining that he wanted to spend more time with his family. Noel claims that it was a series of violations of Noel's no drink or drugs policy during the next album's recording sessions, which resulted in a confrontation between the two. 2 weeks later, Grigsy quit as well. They finished their next album, Standing on the Shoulder of Giants, as a 3-piece, with Noel playing all the guitar and bass parts. After the album was finished, they recruited guitarist Gem Archer to join the band. Finding a bass player was a bit more difficult, but they ended up with Andy Bell, who had his own successes as the singer and guitarist for the band Ride. Andy had never played bass before, but was well respected and fit the dynamic of the band. These two would stay with the band for 10 years until its final demise in 2009. Drummer Andy White left the band in 2004, citing tendinitis in his hands. He was replaced by Zach Starkey, the son of none other than Beatles drummer Ringo Starr. Talk about a charmed life. His dad was a Beatle, then he grew up to play drums for 2 of England's biggest bands, The Who and Oasis. Not a bad resume. So the band continued with the brothers Gallagher being the main focus, backed up by established rock stars. The band continued to thrive and played some legendary gigs that will remain in rock history, but each album got progressively worse. They were never able to recapture the original spark and vibe of the original 5 members, which basically backs up my point. It's not always the best musicians that make the best bands. When lightning strikes, it's hard to recreate. Tensions between the brothers continued to escalate, and a fight between them broke out backstage at a gig near Paris, resulting in Liam throwing one of Noel's guitars at his head. Noel quit right then and there. The gig was cancelled, and we never heard from the band again. The brothers have only spoken to each other a few times since then, and their feud continues. Mind you, it's mostly played out on social media. Noel has gone on to form his own solo project, High Flying Birds, and has since released 4 albums to critical acclaim, and continues to tour the world to sold-out audiences. Everyone keeps asking and speculating about an Oasis reunion, but it appears Noel is having none of it. Perhaps he's perfectly content where he's at right now. I believe it stems from the idea that the only way to have a proper Oasis reunion and recaptured the energy they once had behind them, which had been reformed with all the original members. Anything less would be a sham, and seen as a desperate money grab by the band. Noel in particular. But he knows he didn't exactly split with the rest of the band on good terms. Oasis was a phenomenon that happened in a particular time and place. It would be almost impossible to recreate that. I believe that's exactly why Robert Plant refuses to reform Led Zeppelin. It's had its time and place, and let's just leave it there. For Oasis, bridges have been burned, and it appears there's no going back. So here's my story real quick. I've always been a big fan of English music, and I love to travel. So I went to England and took a bicycle and a backpack and set off across the entire country, interviewing bands along the way to get their story. I spent my nights sleeping on the rooftops of various schools and churches, or on a beach somewhere along the coast. I spent my days cycling around the various cities and towns of England, visiting landmarks and various shops, documenting all that England had to offer. I've created a tour guide of everything cool about England, along with pictures and locations of all the various places I've visited, and can be viewed at englandunderground.com. Like and subscribe.